So this whole meeting is being recorded, and I would request all the participants to keep their microphones on mute throughout the lecture. And after the lecture, there will be a Q&A session also. So we'll discuss we'll be taking question and answer, and we'll be having a discussion with the speaker also. So with that, may I invite Rajvi to give a welcome address.
Thank you, Sagar. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes, you are.
ma'am, please.
Yes, yes. Good afternoon, one and all. On behalf of School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, I heartily welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Luís António Umbelino. Dr. Luís António Umbelino has a PhD in modern and contemporary philosophy and is a professor of philosophy at the Faculty of Humanities of the University of Coimbra, Portugal, and professor honoris causa at the International Institute for Hermeneutics. Professor Umbelino was an invited professor at the University of Toulouse, France, and is currently an invited professor at the University of Salamanca. Professor is the editor-in-chief of the Revista Filosófica de Coimbra and vice president of the Portuguese Association for Phenomenological Studies. His core research has mainly been devoted to philosophical approaches to body and space, crossing the fields of French reflexive tradition, Byronism, contemporary phenomenology, and hermeneutics of architecture. Subjective somatology, a perception of oneself and body in Maine de Biran, 2010, Hermeneutic Rationality, 2012, Memorabilia, The Spatial Side of Memory, 2019, are some of the well-known works of Dr. Umbelino. Today, Professor will be delivering the lecture on a Ricoeurian approach to hermeneutics of architecture, and we are pleased to have you, sir. I may also extend my warm welcome to the Dean of our school, Professor Koshi Tharakan, as well as all the fellow faculties, research scholars, students, and all the participants. Thank you, and over to you, Sagar.
Thank you, Rajvi. So may I now request Dr. Luís António to proceed further with the lecture.
Okay, so thank you. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes, Professor.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me start by thanking the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies at Goa University for putting together this wonderful gathering. I thank you all most sincerely, to Dr. Koshi, of course, also to Vidya for all her generosity and patience along the several emails we have exchanged. Let me tell you that I'm truly honored by this invitation, and I'm extremely happy with the opportunity of spending this, well, in Portugal this morning with you all. So it is a pleasure and an honor. I will organize my talk along four moments, four small moments. First, I will present my starting point, and I will argue in favor of a three-level hermeneutic analysis of dwelling spaces. Then, I will organize my talk in three more points, three more moments, where I will try to consider or approach this three-level hermeneutic analysis of built spaces, so as an approach to hermeneutics. I consider those three-level analysis, those three-level approaches, one from phenomenology, so a phenomenological level, specifically hermeneutic level, and an ontological level. So this will be my the organization of my talk. So starting point, and then three points of view, so to speak, on on space and architecture in a way. So to begin with, so first point. So to begin with, I would like to invite you, so to speak, to visit a picturesque city located at the department of Eure-et-Loire at the center of France. So let us visit, so let us imagine that we visit a small city located at the center of France. Its name, so the name of the city, is Illiers-Combray. So Illiers-Combray. Now, there's something interesting, very interesting, regarding this small French city. Till 1971, Illiers-Combray, so the city, was known just as Illiers. It was only on that year of 71, the year which, by the way, marked the centenary of Marcel Proust's birth, that the people of Illiers decided to rename its city. And the people of Illiers began to call its city Illiers-Combray. The reason for this change was a somewhat surprising yet fully understandable one. The inhabitants of Illiers recognized their small town, the town of Illiers, in Marcel Proust's descriptions of Combray, the literary or imaginary city that we can find in his famous book, À la recherche du temps perdu. And so they decided that such a circumstance should be celebrated in the name of their town. This is, in my view, a very interesting case. Combray is a literary creation of Proust, of Marcel Proust, but it contains evident traces of Illiers, the real small town in the center of France. This city, where the famous novelist's father was born and where Proust himself spent some time during his childhood years, is thus a reference for Combray. Illiers is a real place, a place that offered the basis and the references for the imaginative variations of the literary narrative of Proust. On the other hand, one should add, it is Illiers, it is a place with a peculiar atmosphere, an atmosphere that is determined in part by the narrative possibilities of Combray itself. And this is why the inhabitants of Illiers changed the name of their city. In this context, the decision to rename the town of Illiers, to change it into Illiers-Combray, is a telling one. And beneath that decision, there is a lot to be said about the significance, the hermeneutic significance, of both human space and human active strategies of emplacement. It could be argued, of course, that Illiers-Combray, so the new name of Illiers, is nothing more than Illiers with a new name. One could say the town was just rebranded, as we say today. And we could make the assumption that the presence of Combray, the presence, so to speak, of Combray in Illiers, so to speak, is but a superficial one, something of a deceptive postcard to be explored by tourism and in order to profit from the celebrity of Proust and his masterpiece. But we can also argue in a more interesting way, I would say, and I will argue in this sense, that Coimbra was born of a kind of fundamental hermeneutic gesture that has to do with the fundamental fabric of our way of being in place, of our way of dwelling and belonging to humanized spaces. In this sense, my main argument will be the following one. Coimbra is, in fact, the translation of a, and can be the symbol, so to speak, of a significant crossroad that began in the moment when Illier was reflected in the mirror of Coimbra, Proust's Coimbra, and Coimbra in the mirror of Illier. What is interesting here is that, in my view, such a mutual reflection of a real place in a literary place and of a literary place in a real place is, in fact, a reflexive one. I would like to argue that in a more or less explicit and conscious way, this crossroad, this reflexive, this mutual reflection is true of all cities, and it's true of all architectural projects. That is to say, a real city is always a story of imaginary cities, and any imaginary city is always a story of all the possibilities of certain real cities. And this is, in my view, not a detail. In fact, cities, in fact, real cities and imaginary cities become more authentic in the light of that crossroad between urban spaces and literary narratives. This is what, in my view, Coimbra condenses in a particular clear way. It is as if Illier, the real city, was waiting for Coimbra, the literary city, to truly become Illier. And Coimbra, it seems like Coimbra always needed Illier to be alive in Proust's literary narrative. If we look closely to this possibility, a curious yet fundamental hermeneutic dimension of what Paul Ricoeur called human space can be unfolded. One that can only be disclosed along an overlapping of built spaces and written books. I have in mind here Ricoeur's argument according to which human space, so the peculiar kind of space that can only be found in a point of rupture and suture between geometrical space and lived space. So I have in mind here, this concept of human space that Ricoeur understood as a space one can only access through architecture, as architecture is capable of operating over space, a triple mimesis analogous to the one narrative operates regarding time. In this context, we have to consider the complexity of the third mimesis, refiguration. And there we can find the model of reading as a fundamental hermeneutic model of our, so to speak, way of being in place. What does this mean is that we always, in a way, read spaces, read the spaces we dwell in, looking for the words of the books of stone, as Ricoeur calls the city, as if built spaces were a kind of laboratory of ways of organizing human space that speak directly to our need for authentic guidelines to orient our lives, to orient our actions, as our lives and our actions always happen in place. In this sense, and if we consider the model of reading, the third mimesis on Ricoeur's approach to narrative and also to architecture. So if we consider the model of reading, the third mimesis, maybe we can then add something more to this point of our analysis. We could say, perhaps, something like this. As we read the spaces we dwell in, but as we read, this means as we hermeneutically make the mediations of the places we, as human beings, live in. So this is what I mean by reading places. As we read the places we dwell in, thus completing their meaning by a more authentic and meaningful way of dwelling in them, texts, papers, books are also always a reference. That is to say, maybe human space is always reread in yet another point of rupture and suture, a point to be found between architecture and literary narratives, between, we could say it like this, between buildings and books. So this will be my starting point. So our way of belonging to humanized spaces is a crossroad between buildings and books, between architecture and narrative. This would mean that, if I'm right, of course, this would mean that, in a strong sense, human space, as Ricoeur considers it, and in the sense Ricoeur talks about human space, so this would mean that, in a strong sense, human space is a precise crossroad of literature and architecture. That is to say, a crossroad in which temporal narratives of literature and spatial narratives of architecture can constantly and mutually exchange their meanings and their exemplary ways of accessing time and space. In this sense, literature, that is to say, the narrative model, the narrative hermeneutic model of mimesis, would offer architecture its archetypical way of telling human time. And architecture, hereafter to be understood not just as the act of projecting architectural objects, but as a hermeneutic discipline focusing on prefiguring, configuring, and refiguring human space, would offer, so architecture would offer literature its model way of telling human space by means of the book of stone, once again, as Ricoeur uses the term, by means of the book of stone that every built place, in fact, is. In that exchange between narrative and architecture, finally, human space could be found always on time, and human time could be found always in place. So let me try to test this possibility of a crossroad between narrative and architecture by putting forward what I consider to be a three-level hermeneutic analysis of humanized dwelling spaces. And we will continue to remember the example we presented as our starting point. So literature, narrative and architecture. So this, in my view, gives us an hermeneutic ground to analyze our hermeneutic experiences of built spaces, of built humanized spaces. And to address this hermeneutic fabric of our emplacement, what I propose is to organize our analysis at three levels. So all of them inspired by Ricoeur's perspectives. So let us consider a first level of analysis where we can perhaps confirm these correlations, these crossroads we have been talking about. So the first level of analysis I would like to share with you is a phenomenological level of analysis. I call this second moment of my talk the body in place. So, in my view, to establish our first level of analysis, we must consider the basic conditions of human situatedness and of human emplacement. Those conditions are, to begin with, in my view, corporeal conditions, in the sense Maurice Merleau-Ponty talked about our body as our vehicle of being in the world. If we begin by those conditions, by the embodied conditions of our way of being in the world, one must begin by suspending our common conception of space as we have inherited it from the implicit metaphysics of modern science. Space, from the point of view of our embodied human condition, does not originally appear to our experience, does not originally appear as an homogeneous, geometric, neutral, isotropic extension. On the other hand, on the contrary, space appears as, I would say, a promise of involvement. In this context, an archaic level of approach to space requires a phenomenology of embodied spatiality, as the one entailed by Merleau-Ponty in his famous book, The Phenomenology of Perception. The body Merleau-Ponty is talking about in this book is, needless to say, the lived body, and not just the objective body, not just that conjunction of processes analyzed in physiological logical treatise. As is well known, Merleau-Ponty's original contribution regarding the lived body and the way a lived body belongs to a lived space is the claim that our bodies, our own bodies, the bodies we live as like Ricoeur, are not merely subjective locations of corporeal sensations, are not merely personal bodies, even, but also constitute a pre-reflexive, habitual, silent, and general experience of being in the world, of having a space. So to be a body, and to have a place is, at this level of analysis, exactly the same thing. Or we could say two sides of one same phenomenon. My personal existence, in this sense, is the resumption of a pre-personal perceptive body that can be said to be, and I quote Merleau-Ponty, another subject beneath me, for whom a world exists before I am here, and who marks out my place in it, end quote. This means that at this level of analysis, human subjectivity is embodied from the start, and that to be is, in Merleau-Ponty's sense, to be placed in a world that evades complete interiority. This world is not an object in front of us, in front of the body. It is not something I can fully process, of which it is not something of which I have the law of constitution. Rather, to be in the world is to have a space, is to be in place, as the body marks the natural setting of and the field for all my thoughts and all my explicit perceptions. So, in this sense, Merleau-Ponty would argue, truth does not inhabit only the inner human, the inner human being, or more accurately, there is no interiority in this sense. We are of the world. Our interiority is, in a way, spatial altogether, because our fundamental way of being in the world is by means of a lived body. And it is because of the enigmatic possibilities of such a strata of embodied belonging that we make sense of the body to start with. And to make sense of the we make sense of the world. And to make sense of the world in by means of our embodied condition is to understand that to be of the world is to have a spatial dimension inscribed in our own bodies. This is what allows us to talk about as human embodied beings in the world as this is what allows us to say that our embodied way of being in the world is always determined by, and I quote Merleau-Ponty, an already acquired spatiality, a spatiality of situation that is phenomenologically different from a spatiality of localization. What does this mean is that I'm not in space as an object. I am of space. I belong to space. I am, in a way, space as I am the body. This acquired spatiality, this acquired, I would say, embodied space, embodied original space, is revealed by an enigmatic synchronized familiarity, composed by the habitual body's perceptive and motor dispositions, and by practical callings or demands of space itself, that constantly encourages certain significant bodily gestures, postures, movements, and practical and dynamic choices. This is the system of the body, what Merleau-Ponty calls the system of the body. This is the main idea here, is thus completed by the logic of lived space. So what I mean by this is that at the level of a phenomenological approach to space, it is impossible to distinguish where my body begins and ends and where space begins and ends, because our original experience of being in the world is an experience of spatial involvement, of spatial belonging. It is in this way that we can say that the system of the lived body is completed by the logic of lived space. This is the strata over which the specific connection that exists between subjectivity and place is based on. That is to say that it is over that basis of emplaced and embodied motor significances of space that a new level of analysis can be opened, one by which the complex contents of the subject's mental life and the character of the subject's self-identity, the embodied subject, also remain linked to places where the subject finds itself. Let me put this in a more clear way using a phrase from Ricoeur, and I quote, "Insofar as the body as one's own is a dimension of oneself, the imaginative variations around the corporeal condition are variations on the self and its selfhood." So over our embodied way of belonging to the world, we can establish the dimension of an hermeneutics of oneself as being in the world. This is something that can be exemplarily demonstrated, if we take the link between identity, time, and place as in the context of the connection between places and people in memory. In fact, our sense of the past is linked to a sense of place. And thus, so is memory, namely in its narrative dimension. Places are constitutive elements of the way I tell the story or construct the plots of my life in a meaningful way. So parallel to the connection between places and past, there is thus the proof of a connection between place and narrative. Such parallel remains significant at several levels of our restless way of dwelling, both at the level of embodied motor conditions, phenomenological level, and at the level of imaginative, narrative, and historic possibilities. As we say this, we enter, in a way, a second level of our approach. Not just the level of body in place, as I called it, but the level of the city in place, so the built spaces in place. Let's go back to our example of Illier-Combray, and let us see if what we have been talking about can be demonstrated. To do so, let us imagine a reader of Proust's book, À la recherche du temps perdu. Let us imagine that such a reader decides to visit for the first time the small town once called Illier and now called Illier-Combray. He will certainly verify as a reader that from such a specific place, the real town, emanates an intensive growth of experiences. This is very interesting. So he goes to the city with his body, so to speak, crosses that perceptive experience with imaginative, narrative, and the historic possibilities opened by the book of Proust. He's the reader of Proust in our example. So, and the experience of going to that small town is the experience of an intensive growth of new experiences. That is to say, the visitor of Proust's literary Combray, the visitor of Proust's literary Combray, so the reader, as he visits the real town, will gain in the encounter with that real town a supplement of intensity that speaks directly to the incarnated subject as a kind of familiar, revealing atmosphere. But he will also remark that such intensified experiences of the real town, as how a reader crosses its streets and looks at its buildings, intertwine with the imagined narrative spaces of literary Combray. This circumstance will produce, in my view, a curious effect. Illier-Combray reveals itself more authentically. This is what happens. Illier-Combray, not just Illier, not just Combray, but Illier-Combray reveals itself more authentically. It is as if the intuitive embodied absorption of an atmosphere, the first level, and the literary possibilities of Proust's book, the second level of analysis, were connected, or as if they joined forces in order to help reveal both Combray and Illier-Combray, both Combray, both Illier, both Illier-Combray in a more deep and a more authentic way at the level of an hermeneutic experience. One would say that it is at the moment when both towns, so to speak, exchange, I'm quoting Ricoeur, exchange and lend each other their meanings, the real town lending some kind of atmospheric meaning, the real town offering a kind of atmospheric significance to the town described in the book, the descriptions of the town in the book, lending new hermeneutic dimensions of significance to the real town. It is when the both towns exchange and lend each other their meanings, that, in my view, they truly become real. Better yet, that Illier-Combray truly becomes real. What this means is that a reinterpretation or rereading of lived spaces, of lived built spaces, in this case, a city, and of narrative plots is at the heart of our hermeneutic human condition, our hermeneutic human condition for dwelling. But as we deal with this circumstance, in fact, as I've already said, we are already crossing a second layer a second level of our analysis, a hermeneutic level of analysis. So to fully explore and to fully explore this second level of analysis, we must, in a way, extend the last argument presented above to its full range of application. We could say something like this: the narrative understanding of oneself through the spatial understanding of oneself, the in-placed understanding of oneself, becomes effective by means of an overlapping or a translation, in the hermeneutic sense, between the mutual changing meanings made possible in the temporal laboratory of narrative and in the spatial laboratory of architecture. Now, what do I mean by this? First of all, such a claim cannot be understood, of course, in a limited in a limited way. That is to say, this possibility cannot be understood if we reduce it to the particularisms of those who live or of those who have visited Illier or that know Coimbra from reading Proust's book, of course. In a way, what we have to understand is that the experience of Proust's reader as he visits the real town, now called Illier-Coimbra, is not a particular experience, an experience of just a specific person, but is in fact the ground. It is, in a way, the heart of any hermeneutic experience of dwelling. What I mean by this is that, in a way, every one of us has experienced, more or less explicitly, more or less consciously, in a more or less explicit way, that same overlapping of space and narrative, of literature, history, etc., and architecture. Someone living or visiting, for instance, Goa or Paris or New York, or visiting Coimbra, and of course we should all visit Coimbra, that's for sure, only, this is my argument, only truly visits those places, over a background of images and stories, of buildings and books that refigure, that are reread in place. Because we are all readers and narrative beings. So our hermeneutic fabric is this one. And this is why we are, this is an implication, we are all, in a way, readers of places, of the places we dwell in. We would say that we are thus, in a way, all readers of Proust, in the sense that we are all inhabitants of cities, of built spaces. In a way, on the other hand, we are all inhabitants of Illier-Coimbra. That is to say, we are all dwellers of real cities with imaginary and transitional dimensions of in-placed memories, stories, culture, and so on. What I mean by this is that to live or visit a, so to speak, real city is always to live and visit narrative cities. in a way that, in the sense that memories, stories, culture, and so on are a part of the hermeneutic fabric of the places we dwell in. So I'm I'm close to my last point. In a certain sense, we do not visit a place without mixing its streets and buildings, its landscapes and atmospheres with, say, narrative, cinematographic, artistic, historical references that operate on us like a kind of active interpretative tools of what we live in place, of what means to be in place. On the other hand, prepared by narrative atmospheres, when we visit, say, city or a plot of or a city or a street or even a building, the plot that built spaces are becomes the occasion, well beyond touristic hastiness, to intensify, confirm, change, or substitute the mediating plots we inevitably bring along. Be it as it may, the city, in our example, appears as perceived through the lenses of narratives, of literary narratives, cinematographic narratives, poetic images, historical plots. And these plots are plots refigured through the lenses of the deep involving fabric of urban plots. So we tell the story of our emplacements crossing architecture as we understood it, as Ricoeur understands it, as a way of prefiguring, configuring, and refiguring human space, and the exemplary temporality we access by narrative. So this argument must, of course, be extended to a properly anthropological level. The cities and places we inhabit, where we dwell in, the places and cities we visit are always somehow imagined. Reversibly, such cultural mediations are always already marked by spatial references that are inscribed in our situated, corporeal, and lived way of being that marks the human, our human way of being as always from somewhere, as always being from somewhere. We can be more precise here and say something like this. Built spaces, so the spaces architecture hermeneutically mediates, offers narrative of human time, a supplement of density and durability, a set of alternative plots. In this sense, a city can be a kind of book, a book of stone. We already used this expression. Such a book is, as any other book, is open to our reading or refiguring. While the literary narratives of time remains a reservoir of heterodox meanings that help us tell the story of our way of dwelling. And if this is true of narrative, so it is true of architecture that offers the narratives of human time spatial plots. Plots that give human time new intensities, new and more authentic possibilities of making sense of one's emplaced life and actions. So let us go back once again to Il y est compris. it is plausible to suggest that, in a certain way, Proust's exemplary literary descriptions of Combray lends itself to the already in place urban plot of Illier, as if Combray helped us belong more authentically to the real city. What is interesting here is that in this case, the urban plot of the once called Illier, the urban plot made of streets and buildings, landscapes and atmospheres, that are, of course, well known of the inhabitants of the city, has already lended its spatial and architectural references to the act of narrating the time of Combray in Proust's novel. So this is very interesting. So real spaces intensify the stories, that is to say, intensify our way of belonging to a human time. And at the same time, the narrative of time in the novel makes the real town more authentic as a place human beings can dwell in. Illier-Combray, in this sense, symbolizes, in my view, a mutual in-place exchange of meanings between what is narrated of time and what is constructed of space, between the book and the town, between books and cities. And what this circumstance produces in the inhabitants and visitors of Illier-Combray is this. Of Illier-Combray or of Goa, Paris, New York, Coimbra, so on. It's the same example. And what this circumstance produces in the inhabitants and visitors of the town of Illier-Combray is this. To a certain extent, by the mixing of literature and architecture, the inhabitant and visitor of Illier-Combray becomes, in a way, a reader of Proust. And at the same time, any reader of Proust becomes an inhabitant of Illier. This is, in my view, an intense way of experiencing, an intense and fundamental way of experiencing the human way of dwelling in built spaces, as such a way can be unfolded by an hermeneutic approach. So, when we read, let's put in the place of Illier-Combray any other town, any other city. Yeah? So, what makes us truly know that place is not just the objective presence of a body as an object within the city, but a crossroad between my belonging, and in a way, my readings. So it is an hermeneutic fabric that is here at stake. Let us finish with one last level of analysis. This one, I will only point out to it. So, and maybe we can discuss it a little bit further in the debate. So, this the third level of analysis is what I call the earth in place. So, first level, the body in place. Second level, the city in place. Third level, the earth in place. So, why do we need a third level of analysis if we arrive to the heart of the hermeneutic fabric of dwelling in this crossroad between narrative and architecture, symbolized by Illier-Combray? Well, I think Ricoeur that we are following here implicitly points yet to a third level of analysis. Let us try to sketch it. I stated earlier that the reinterpretation or rereading of lived built places and of and of narrative plots in the novel, the example of the novel was our example here, but we could also talk about historical narratives and so on. So I stated earlier, that the reinterpretation or rereading of lived built places and of literary or narrative plots, as they mutually lend and intensify their meanings mutually, is to be found at the heart of our hermeneutic human condition as an in-place condition. This leads, this, in my view, can lead us to a third level of analysis, an ontological level, but an ontological level that is pointed out still from an hermeneutic perspective. What does this mean? What I mean by this is something we could present like this. It is true, we have already considered it. A human being is, as of course we have been using Heidegger's famous expression, if a human being is, as Heidegger puts it, a being in the world, and if nothing is more essentially related to our being in the world, as we have been stressing, then our way of belonging to human spaces in Ricoeur's sense, so a space that is humanized by architecture. If this is so, if a human being is being in the world, and if being in the world is to be in place, it becomes clear that we take our measure of being, this is a crucial point, we take our measure of being from what surrounds us. And what surrounds us is always, to some extent, of our own making. Building, which starts from the ground up, is where the fundamental ontology of our mundane lives both begins and ends. Let us go back one last time to Coimbra. And let's now consider this. When visiting the small town, we mingle Coimbra's narrative configuration with the tangible inhabitable reality of Illier. At the same time, the reality of Illier, the once called Illier, offers a surplus of intensity to Coimbra. This we have already said. We could then say that Illier-Coimbra, some as a symbol of the hermeneutic fabric of our way of belonging to the world, sums it up by becoming a more authentic place as we learn to reread it between buildings and books in our own lives. In this case, as Ricoeur puts it, and I quote, literary fictions differ fundamentally from technological fictions in that they remain imaginative variations on an invariant, our corporeal condition experienced as the existential mediation between the self and the world, end quote. What this means, and I'm getting to the end, as we learn, what this means is that as we learn to read the built spaces that sustain the situatedness of our corporeal condition along narratives, something peculiar happens. On one hand, we understand that characters in novels, for instance, are, in a way, humans, and I'm quoting Ricoeur, humans like us who think, speak, act, and suffer as we do in places. They are so because they, like us, the characters, think, speak, act, and suffer as always in place. On the other hand, as we thus learn something about our way of being in place when we read, we begin to understand that it is impossible to experience built spaces, the spaces of architecture, as a purely physical entity, as each built space, buildings, cities, streets, etc., speak to our embodied being in the world and carry not only an affective tone, but also a symbolic, cultural, narrative flair. If this is so, then we can add something more here to our analysis. The point of rupture and suture, where architecture unfolds human space, in fact, mingles and overlaps the point of rupture and suture, where human time also unfolds between what Ricoeur calls geological time and lived time. In a way, then, architecture constantly brings to our emplaced embodied situatedness, as it unfolds within dwelling spaces, the mark of a fundamental place moment. A place moment by which geological time is transformed into human time by means of a construction of the built worlds we live in, and where historical and existential time can take place. Let's try to say it in a more clear way. Architecture is also what constantly and implicitly remind us of what we, as human beings, are always up against. Geological time, the elements, the earth. In this sense, architecture is implicitly a narrative of the very ground of our human-built worlds. And that ground is, in Ricoeur's perspective, the earth itself. The earth as Rousseau talked about the earth, as Merleau-Ponty talked about nature. We are talking about the place where all the places can take place, and that presumably will outlast them all. Ricoeur points to this crucial aspect as follows, and I quote to finish my presentation: "In virtue of the mediating function of the body as one's own, in the structure of being in the world, the feature of selfhood belonging to corporeality is extended to that of the world as it is inhabited corporeal. This feature defines the terrestrial condition as such," end quote. We could then say that architecture plays a fundamental role here, as it is in those links between body, hermeneutic mediations, and the flair of the place that is the ground for all places, that we can write our history. So an hermeneutic perspective to architecture, to the spaces we dwell in, must follow this three, in my view, of course, this three-level approach. As such, human condition for dwelling is in itself a plot made of body, architecture, and the earth. So I thank you, and I hope that I didn't go beyond my time, the time of the conference. So thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Professor Umbelino. It was very interesting speech. Let's see whether any interaction from the students and other research scholars are coming. I could see many of them. Vidya, who is monitoring the discussion?
Aditi. Over to you, Aditi.
Yes, thank you, Vidya. Thank you, sir.
Aditi, I'm not able to hear. Yeah, okay.
Am I audible?
Yeah, yes, now I can hear.
Okay. Thank you for such an interesting talk, Professor. The session is now open for questions and or discussions. You can either type your queries or questions or discussion in chat box or raise your hand and ask the question.
As questions, may emerge. The whole ideas started singing in. Let me just try to understand. What if instead of architecture or buildings, if we were to think about other human endeavors like agriculture, for example, and olive garden, for example. When I visited Portugal, Lisbon, the olive gardens there, without any book in stone, but rather, let's say, book in life of plants. Would that kind of connection that Ricoeur talks about between narrative and architecture, that linkage that you have explained, would the degree of that experience be similar, or do you think there is anything more specific to this relation between architecture and narrative?
Thank you so much for your question. It is in fact a very interesting and very precise question. So, in fact, in one of the few papers that Ricoeur devotes to the subject of architecture, he in fact always talks about architecture and urbanism. So his thesis is that the built plot, the plot of built spaces that constitute a city, that for him is the reference for the human way of being in place. Okay, so, and this is controversial, of course, but what he says is that architecture is always completed by urbanism, so by the larger organization of the city. And what this means is that for him, of course, a city is not just a building. It's not just buildings. It's buildings connected in a certain way with streets, gardens, the connection with the geography of the city. So, for instance, if we have a city near the sea, this means that the city is always more than a couple of buildings. It's a way to look at the sea, right, in a way, and this is always completed by urbanism. And it's in this sense, he's also talking about a larger organization of inhabited space, of inhabited human space. But for him, so in this sense, gardens are a kind of are like a very important character in the Book of Stone. So it's in the sense that, of course, if we only have buildings, we don't have a city. This is very, very interesting, because what a city is not, in my view, what for Ricoeur is a city is the hermeneutic dimension of the city, and the hermeneutic dimension is that it represents a certain kind of plot. For instance, in Coimbra, here in my city, so the city is crossed by a river, okay, by a river. So half of the city is on one side of the river, the other side of the city is on the other side, and the river is very important for the story of the city. So Coimbra was built in this particular place because of the proximity with the river, and because of the geography. Along the story of the city, the river is fundamental, is crucial. There's a part of the story of the city that is told around the river, and this is very interesting. For instance, if we take the Coimbra, as you know, is mainly a small university city. So it's a typical medieval city that has the university at its center. And so a part of the history of the city is the story of the university and of the students that came to study here. And the most important artistic representations of the city have all the river in the middle. So the students go to the river to study, to be with their girlfriends. So the river is a romantic place, whatever, etc., etc. So what I'm getting at is this. So this is why on both sides of the river, in the center of the city, we have gardens. Okay, why? Because there's an hermeneutic significance in gardens, as they are the easiest way for people to get close to the river. Okay, so what is the city here? The city is what the city is telling us is that to be next to the river is to be next to a romantic, peaceful place that must be protected and whatever. So this is the human space. So the human space is not the garden, is not the river, is not the building. It's the plot, as in a novel. It's a plot between building, garden, and river, as this connection helps me in my life give value to the connections with the water, for instance. So this is so yes. So for Ricoeur, in my view, gardens, as they are projected by humans, they are a fundamental character of the Book of Stone, in this sense.
Thank you for that explanation.
Thank you. So the question was a very interesting one. It's always difficult to put questions, to make questions after a talk.
Take some time to think in.
But
Any other questions?
Yes,
Yes, sir. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Thanks, Professor Umbelino, for the talk. Like as you pointed out, it's very difficult to formulate questions at this point. So I'll just try to, I have a few things to bring up. So one is the reading of, a parallel reading between books and cities as books of stones. So when somebody is involved with the text, the relation is, I would say, like very subjective, because like you can interpret a text in various ways. And where I'm getting at with this is, do we also have to take a look at an epistemological side of relating to buildings and spaces? Because I could be in a space that is very confounding for me, or a space could give me anxiety, or make me panic. So it's not that the understanding between one situatedness in space and the comfort of the situatedness, can it always be presumed, is the first question. And the second part I wanted to ask about is regarding your use of the word authentic places. When you said that cities become authentic places of dwelling, so it relates to the first question, of course, like how is it possible to understand a single place as becoming authentic when it might just be one individual's idea of authentic relating to that space. So I would just like to hear more on your idea of authentic spaces and the first question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your two questions. Once again, these are two very interesting and, in fact, philosophical questions. So let me thank you for that. So because in fact they help me clarify some points, and this is why the best part of the talks for me is this part. So it's not when I'm talking, but when we are discussing. So the first question. So the epistemological perspective. Yes, of course we can consider that, but what Ricoeur is talking about is that such an epistemological approach is never enough to fully account for our human way of dwelling. Okay, but there's a part there. Perhaps it is at the first level of approach that the epistemological side of the problem is more clear, because at the first level of approach, we are still asking, how can we know space, okay, at the most fundamental layer of our experience, okay? And there, Ricoeur takes Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological horizon and tells us something like this. Well, place for us is something that we begin by knowing, that we begin to know by our own way of being a body. So this is the question. So in our way of being a body, we can begin to know how space appears. So, and in this sense, what you said is very precise. And how do we know space in our body? As a familiarity of something that involves, that surrounds the body, and that at the same time calls for the body and can derange the body. Okay? So this, let me give you an example. So in Merleau-Ponty's perspective that Ricoeur takes as a presupposition, as something he assumes. So we know lived space in the way we live our body. So this is the idea. Okay. So and if we describe all we can live spatially, we are describing space as it is lived, not as it is conceived by geometry, for instance, but as it is lived. Okay. So, for instance, let me give you an example, very well, something that crossed my mind. So, for instance, we know that before we begin to think, the difference between being laid down and being raised up, it is different. There's a difference between those two aspects in our bodies. How do we know this? It's simple. If we look at a small baby, okay, we can see that even before before he starts to think, he wants to try to walk. He begins to try to walk. He makes like this with his hands, trying to find help to be up. Then he starts by walking with his hands on the ground. Then he starts to try to take to walk on his feet. So this is, for Ricoeur, for Merleau-Ponty, an interesting example. This means that for the body, for our way of being a body, there's a difference between being laid down, and to be sorry, I forgot the word, and to be on our 2 feet. So there's a difference between horizontality and verticality, even before we begin to think about these concepts. So, and this is space. This is space as it is lived in the body. So perhaps this is the moment where an epistemological question is within a phenomenological approach. But what is interesting, and this takes me to your second very, very important and interesting question, but what Ricoeur is explaining to us is that to ask what space is, even from a phenomenological perspective, is not enough to fully understand how we experience space, because we experience space always already as a humanized space. So this is the thing. So we do not exist only as bodies, as lived bodies. We are people. We are a person, and the person is someone who does not only live space, but interprets space. Okay, so this is the question. So to ask what space is must be completed by the question: how do we humans interpret space? Okay. Now, what Ricoeur is saying is that the human way of interpreting space begins with architecture. So architecture is already a way of interpreting space, in the sense that I am giving space form, significance, orientations, uses, and so on and so on. And I'm transforming it in dwelling places. So this is an anthropological dimension. We do not have the option of interpreting or not space. Why? Because we already live in hermeneutically interpreted places. So because architecture is hermeneutic. So, for instance, any house, any kind of house, is an interpretation of lived space by itself. The detail is that for Ricoeur, any hermeneutic interpretation it follows the model of reading, does not end until someone applies that interpretation to its own life. Okay, so what does this mean? For instance, we have a home. We have around the world different types of homes, but they are all ways of the human way of interpreting space. Okay, but that interpretation for Ricoeur only ends when someone inhabiting the place learns something about the way to live with that place. Okay, so in this sense, what is an authentic place? An authentic place is an interpreted place that already helps me to live in a humane way, in a human way, to fully live in a hermeneutic way. So let me try to give you an example. Once again, a very quick example. So please forgive me, because this is the fault of it's the deformation, the professional deformation of the professor. Is always looking for examples. Sometimes the examples are good, sometimes the examples do not help, but well, I will try anyway. So for instance, if I'm also from my philosophical training, I'm also a phenomenologist, so I like to use my own experience as a laboratory for philosophy. Okay, so for instance, when I look at my experience and I ask myself, this is an example that I take from my life, but I think this is an universal example, as I showed in the talk. So when we get to the bottom of human experiences, they are experienced individually, but they are universal. This is the hermeneutic presupposition, the hermeneutic horizon. So, for instance, if I look at my experience and I say this, for instance, for me to welcome a friend in my house, okay, for me it's an important thing. Okay, so to welcome someone, well, what do I do when I welcome a friend in my house? For instance, I can invite him to eat with me. Okay, so this is an example everybody can understand, of course. Now, if I ask myself, where did I learn the importance of hospitality? Okay, where? I have to say this, of course. My father and my mother taught me a little bit. After that, books, movies, philosophical books, religious books, historical books, okay? They all helped develop my sense of hospitality. But if I look at my experience, there's one last thing that taught me the importance of hospitality, and that was the way the house I grew up in was organized. Because in the house I grew up with, and this is culturally, it was culturally like this, the house of my parents' houses, that had a place where we had a table, and where we when someone dear to us visited us, we used that place to eat. Okay, so this is very interesting. So, and what this means is that when we welcome people in our homes, they are friends, it is important to welcome them. So I began to learn this not because someone told me, but because the space, because architecture, the architecture of my parents' house was designed in a particular way. The examples can change in different cultural contexts, but it's the same. So to welcome someone around the fireplace, around the table, in the garden, in a balcony, in a big in a saloon, whatever. But we learn with spaces. And when we learn with spaces, we become more authentically in place. Why? Because we know what spaces mean. And when we know what spaces mean, we begin to know a little bit more about what we mean. So this is what in my view, Ricoeur is talking about when he talks about authenticity. So authenticity has to do with the hermeneutic interpretation. So if I interpret more, I understand more, so I know more what I am and what I'm doing. I don't know if my examples helped or not, but it's authenticity here is a very modest concept. Okay, it's not an arrogant concept. It's a modest concept. We are authentic when we each time we know a little more about ourselves, about our fragility, about our flaws, but also about our virtues, about our fragility, but also about our strengths. So this is what I meant. I don't know if and we learned that with space. So space is as important as a book, because it is a kind of book. Okay. So, and the examples, well, the example with the river is one example. Right? But we have others. For instance, I don't know if you have a religious monument, okay, in a city, and around that monument, the city builds a square, for instance, okay. All the if I get to that sacred or religious place, okay, and I have to cross a garden, for instance, all this is a way for me to learn the importance of the place. Okay? And the importance of the place, it's of course is a kind of experience that helps me become more what I am, in a way. I don't know if I could answer properly to your questions. These were more well, some thoughts to react to your questions, because they are complex, and we should continue to discuss them, of course.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks also for the examples. Matter of fact, I could relate to the, when you spoke of intentions being built into houses, for example. Yeah. So in India, I come from a state called Tamil Nadu, and I think Professor Koshi may be aware. Like in every houses in a village, we used to have something called tinne, or a sit out. So it's even before the door of house, so it's just between the door and the road, so wherein you just gather, so you don't have to ask anybody even to gather there, or to occupy that space. So that it's kind of is given as an example of hospitality. Yeah, so and India, like thinking about intentions being built into spaces, I think this is where my question on authenticity came from, because when you said, I agree when you said that we become more authentic by interpreting spaces more. If I could go for a follow-up, do we have any rules of interpreting spaces? And what happens when one of my interpretation conflicts with the an existing interpretation or a status quo? Yeah, what happens? I think yeah, this is where the question of authenticity also stems from, I guess. Yeah.
Well, Arvi, it's quite known, I am sure, to Professor, because what we call thinne is veranda for them. The house. Veranda, in Portuguese version. Okay.
No, I think I understood. Yeah. So once again, this is a very interesting question, because you see what's interesting here. This is why for Ricoeur, let me just give you this perspective. I think it's interesting. This is why for Ricoeur, architecture is similar to narrative, because architecture's relations to space is characterized by the three mimesis of narrative. So what is this? So the first one is prefiguration. What does this mean? This means that architecture gives form to something that has already a kind of form in my experience. Okay, so for instance, let me give you an example. It starts to rain, and I'm outdoor, so it starts to rain. What I immediately do is well, it's just an example. I run to cover from the rain, to protect myself from the rain, and I can even use I don't know a plastic bag and put it over my head. So what does this mean? This means that when architecture makes a ceiling, okay, it's already sorry, before that, when I put, for instance, when I open an umbrella, okay, this is in a way a prefiguration. So I'm giving a first form to something that it has to do with my life. After that, when architecture builds houses with ceilings, architecture is giving sense in infinite ways to the same thing, protecting from the elements. Okay? Now, but to know what a ceiling is, I still have to go home and be protected, and learn that to be protected is to have a ceiling. Okay. Now, and what does how do I understand this? So in Portuguese, we have an expression. I don't know if it's the same, well, everywhere, but it's just an example. We have a saying that well, Portugal has been for a long time. It's a small country, so it's not a rich country. So for Portuguese people, for decades and decades, okay, to have a house was something very important. Okay, now why? Because to have a house, we have this expression. There's in English, there's also this expression, so I think it's understandable. So why is a house important? Because it's to have a roof over one's head. A roof over one's head. Now, but this is what am I saying here? That I learn with a house what it means to have a home, to be able to protect me from the menaces. There's where I can have a family, where I can protect my family. where I can come after work, and so on and so on and so on. And all this is it's me refigurating, that is to say, rereading a roof over my head. Now, this is the example of the roof, but in all the buildings, this exists. And when I built a home, what happens is that to have a roof over one's head makes part of the new buildings. They have to be more and more original, more and more strong, more and more sustainable, more, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so this is the circularity. Now, the question you asked me is that is there any rules to interpret buildings? For Ricoeur, yes, the same ones as we have to read books. Okay, and what are those rules? There are several rules, but the first one is this: no interpretation is a definitive interpretation. First one. This means that each book and each building is interpreted in a conflict between interpretations. Yeah, so this is the first rule. So no one is able to give a full interpretation of a building. Why? Because it's like a book. And in a book, there's a difference between interpretations and the world of the book, what Ricoeur calls the world of the book. That is the sense, the reservoir of senses, of meanings that are within the text, and that can only be unfolded when they are extended within my way of living. So this is the main, these are the two main rules: conflict of interpretations, no security, and offering our own need for meaning. Okay, so okay, so Aruvi, I thought he went out and then he came back. So
there is a problem with the connectivity, so it goes off and on.
Okay, so let me summarize. So the rules, the main rules are this one. First, no definitive interpretation. Second, openness to the conflict of interpretations. Third, contribute to open up the world of the text or the world of the building. How is this made? By offering my needs for meaning to the building or to the text. What does this mean, to offer my life? It's the experience of needing an orientation, okay, and applying the possibilities of a book or of a building to my life. And when that application is made, the book continues to be read and the building continues to be interpreted. So these are the, in my view, so in a very quick and schematic way. I don't know if I answered, and if you...
Yeah, thanks, Professor. That was clear. I think you even began with the, saying that there is no definitive interpretation to, that is probably the first rule of, the rule of continuous. And
But why? Why? Because the way to inhabit and to reread buildings is constantly open. So let me give you an example. So let's say when I'm at home, I'm at home, I reread my house in a particular way. So I say, okay, so this is nice. I have to change this. I would prefer that. but at least I have a place to stay, whatever. If I travel abroad and I stay at an hotel, okay, so I learn different things from the space. I don't know. So, for instance, let me, I want to be alone. A way to learn how to be alone is to stay alone in a hotel. Okay, because that's a way to learn how to be alone and the possibilities of what that means. Okay, so this is lending my life to buildings and books in order to contribute for the opening of the meanings they have inside. This is why we continue to read classic books, for instance. In philosophy, this is very important for us. Why do we still read books from Plato and Aristotle, for instance? Okay? Why? Well, because the world of the books is not yet exhausted. They continue to give meaning to the questions we have today. This is true of books. This is true of humanized spaces, according to Ricoeur.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you for your question.
Any more questions or discussions? Yes, Vidya, you can go ahead.
Hi, Professor. I wanted to ask you about what Ricoeur talks about the ideological presuppositions of the builder, sometimes overpowering the needs of the inhabitants. So, what happens when a builder decides to build a building over another building, which has historical significance? And in the absence of that book of stone, of that historical building, how can we then learn from it? And what we learn about ourselves from buildings then become hegemonized based on the ideological presuppositions of the builder.
Yeah. Thank you once again. Yet another very interesting question. Yeah, and a difficult one also. So I would say this. So when I'm working with Ricoeur's perspective on architecture, I'm always following his suggestion of an analogy between architecture and narrative. What this means is that for Ricoeur, there's something similar. He states it clearly in one of his papers. There's an analogy between what the architect is doing and of what the novelist is doing. The novelist is organizing and giving us access to human time. The architect is humanizing and giving us access to human space. Okay. So if this is similar, this means that when we interpret a book, we interpret we interpret space, build spaces in the same way. Okay. Well, for Ricoeur, interpretation, hermeneutic interpretation, is something that only, in fact, can be unfolded, developed, when, sorry, let us consider a book. So when I read a book, the interpretation of the book can only be fully developed if I do not once again, if I do not pay attention to what the author says, or to what the author has to say about his book. Ricoeur, in one of his papers on when he's trying to define what is a text, you will know this famous text for sure. He says something like this. Well, the best. Well, I'm quoting by heart, so please forgive me if it's not exactly like this. I haven't read this paper for quite some time now, but something like this. The ideal situation for a reader when he's reading a book is to consider the author of the book he's reading as already dead. What does this mean? What this means is that the novelist's intentions, ideologies, and so on, and the architect's intentions, ideologies, beliefs, and so on, are not important for my interpretation. Why? Are not important because they are limited. They are limited to a context, to a temporal moment, and to an agenda. But what is interesting is that when a book is written or a building is built, they become more rich in meanings than what the author thought of the buildings. And so, to interpret spaces, I have to suspend the original contexts of the building and of the book, so I can open the world of the book by applying the book or the building, by applying it to my life today. So this is why I can today read a book that originally was, I don't know, politically controversial. Well, but that is not all a book is, and this is the same with architecture. So I can have, I can use a building that was, for instance, originally built in well, with I don't know, dominating intentions. Okay, but for me, when I use the building, that cannot exhaust or limit my interpretation, because, well, that building can also be beautiful, useful, or the other way around, can be questionable, can be uncomfortable. Okay, so the importance is here. So for Ricoeur, I would say that the author must not be present, so to speak, in the moment we are interpreting it, because both the books of stone and the books of literature are more, they keep more meanings than those intended by their authors. And how do I know that? Because when they reverberate in my life, they help me build new meanings. Meanings that are more rich than those intended by their authors. So this, I would say, would be a provocative answer from Ricoeur, I would say.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Professor, for those answers. And if you have more questions, or discussion, you can directly reach out to Professor. The professor's email is put in the chat box. And now I invite Aruvi for the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Aditi. A very good evening to one and all. On behalf of the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies at Goa University, I take this chance to propose a vote of thanks for today's talk. At the outset, I extend my thanks to the distinguished speaker for today, Professor Umbelino, for taking the time out of his schedule to be with us and for talking to us on a Ricoeurian approach to the hermeneutics of architecture. Thank you, Professor. I also thank Professor Koshi, Dean, School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies at Goa University, and all other faculty members of the school, Professor Sanju, Dr. Norma, Dr. Walter, and Ms. Rajvi, for their continued support in organizing the lecture series. My heartfelt thanks to all the research scholars of the school for their tireless efforts backstage and front stage in making this event possible. I'm also indebted to share a word of gratitude for everyone who helped spread the word about the talk. And finally, I'm at a loss of words to express my gratitude to all the participants, faculty members, students, and scholars from other departments, schools, colleges, and universities for enlivening the event with your presence. I conclude my speech thanking one and all for directly and indirectly contributing to the realization of today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Aruvi.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Umbelino. I mean, personal thanks from my side. We continue to interact, hopefully, in different forums, and always welcome to Goa.
Thank you. Thank you very much once again for your warm welcome, your generosity, and well, let us keep in touch.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Thank you all.
Hope
Thank
to see you soon here. The recording of the lecture will be available on our department's, our school's YouTube channel, and we will soon be back with another lecture, so stay tuned. Thank you. Have a great evening.